Yeah, I don't know that that works.
Technical difficulty no matter what. Okay, well, sorry.
That's okay.
Okay, guys. Thanks everyone for coming. This is the last WildEcol of the semester. The team and I are working together on getting a roster for next semester. So we have a few speakers lined up for that. Just keep an eye out on emails and we'll get that sent out to put that on your calendar and everything like that. So today's speaker is Stephen Van Wilgenburg, and he's a biologist with Environment and Climate Change Canada, where he has worked since 1998. He grew up on a dairy farm in Nova Scotia, where he spent lots of time camping. He also went fishing, canning, catching frogs, and salamanders, which is still his love. Over his career, Steve has been very fortunate to have a varied career, conducting research in fields like acoustic survey methods, stable isotope ecology, avian migratory connectivity, and the responsive boreal bird communities to natural and anthropogenic disturbance. More recently, Steve's work has focused on the design and implementation of bird monitoring programs to expand avian monitoring efforts north of areas covered by citizen science. His program aims to leverage the data he collects to aid conservation of boreal birds from local to global scales by broadly collaborating with a multitude of individuals, agencies, and other opportunities. So without further ado, please join me and welcome Stephen to WildEcol.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today. All right, so many of us had this experience growing up, going out, being in nature, camping, maybe hearing and seeing. Can you see where my cursor is? There it is. Hearing the background environment, maybe hearing the loon as some iconic memory for most of us growing up in Canada. But there's a lot of information contained in that soundscape, right? And a lot of that information can be used to understand what's happening with the environment. So when we go out in the environment and listen, we can garner a lot of information, whether it's the species occupancy, species composition of the communities, or we can maybe even garner species abundance or density, either from putting a human out in the environment or a sound recorder. And there's also extra information that we can garner when we have an actual sound recording. So every time there's a call recorded on that recording, as long as it's not masked by other sounds on there, you can do things like measure the sound pressure level, which is an indicator of other things like how far away the bird is from the recording unit. And that can be used to improve our inference on what the birds are doing. There's also a lot that can be garnered about the demography of individuals. It turns out that with birds, at least, the singing rates are actually pretty good indicators of nesting success, pairing success, the number of individuals in a clutch in some cases. So we can actually look at how frequently birds are singing and garner something about their demography if we do the background work to validate that. Now, for much of my career, bird surveys were done using this sort of method, putting a human out in the field where they would stand at a predetermined location and count everything that they heard or seen within a few defined criteria. So you would count what you heard or saw within a defined time period. In the case of my boreal forest surveys, most people use a 10-minute survey, but some ecosystems, and depending on what lab you started doing things in, it might be a 3 or 5 minute survey. One might also do distance estimation. So you can see this data sheet here where someone's estimating whether the bird's within 50 meters or 50 to 100 meters and then beyond 100 meters. And you can either just remove everything beyond 100 meters and say the area of this survey is, pi r squared, 100 meters. I can't remember what, it's probably 3 hectares. Or you can actually fit distance models and estimate the effective detection radius for a given species. Now, that sort of survey was done for years, mostly by citizen scientists across North America. The primary data that we have for tracking the status and trends of North American birds comes from the North American Breeding Bird Survey, initiated in the late 1960s, with data, more or less in Canada, tracking from about 1970 onward. It's a roadside survey where volunteers go and drive 26 point some kilometers and record every bird that they see and hear 50 stops along that road route. The problem, though, is for people like me that have to, report on the status and trends of boreal forest birds, is if you look on the map there's a lot of a lot of areas with no surveys, and that's largely because there's very little in the way of roads in the boreal forest. So after years and years of data being reported, we do have some concerning trends that were reported from those roadside surveys, with a few real standout groups of birds. Grassland birds, everyone here has probably heard about the plight of grassland birds. Not that surprising with the amount of grassland habitat that's been converted to agriculture, both here as well as in their wintering areas in southern US and Mexico. But despite the fact that the boreal forest is very remote, the group that was the next most highly, or had the greatest drop in population sizes since the 1970s was boreal forest birds. And so there's a lot of reason to be concerned, even though despite the fact that there's a vast wilderness there with very little occurring. However, when we do look at what we have for data, it's pretty biased. This is a depiction of data amassed by the Boreal Avian Modeling Project, which is a project out of the University of Alberta that amalgamated data from various research scientists across Canada, consulting companies, the North American Breeding Bird Survey. And when you take a look at the data, there's large gaps in particularly the north part of the boreal forest. So there's spatial and temporal gaps in the data that really preclude us from providing very in-depth and comprehensive estimates of what is happening to the status and trends of birds across the entire region. So that leaves us with a conundrum, especially given the fact that there's a lot happening in the boreal. There's obviously been expansion over the past 40 years of forestry at the southern edges of the boreal forest. Things like the oil sands has obviously been in the news a lot. That's expanded significantly. There's a lot of other things like uranium mining, precious metals. Right now, critical minerals. You might have heard of the Ring of Fire in Ontario. There's a lot of interest in punching in roads and extracting minerals that we use in things like our cell phones and computer chips, with markets for those minerals mostly dominated by China. There's a lot of interest there's enough interest that the US military actually sunk $200 million into Canadian mine development. So there's probably going to be some environmental pressure from that. And that is all overlaid on climate change occurring at the greatest rates the further north you go. And so much of the northern boreal forest is experiencing some of the most rapid climatic changes. And in recent years, that has made itself known through a lot of the large fires that we've been seeing. So we need to implement new surveys to try to address that. There are a lot of challenges for us. Some of it's related to staffing, and we have limited budgets. Some of it's also logistical constraints. There's a lot of birds that sing at times of day that are not very convenient for doing surveys. A lot of nocturnal birds, for example. It's not exactly the safest thing walking through areas with cliffs and floating fens in the middle of the night, as well as the majority of the area doesn't have roads, so there's high access costs and the possibility of staff running into bears and forgetting their bear spray, as well as there's a lot of challenges in trying to integrate data. Like, for example, probably most of you have heard of some of the citizen science projects like eBird. All those use slightly different data collection methods, and so one has to come up with methods of making the data comparable across those programs. And then ultimately, we don't want to just be tracking whether a species is going extinct. We want to actually have some conservation action on the ground. So getting that data used in ways rapidly that also directly informs conservation. Fortunately, one thing that has made things a lot easier for us is the advent of autonomous recording units. So some of the earliest work was done actually with some not autonomous but manned recording units that were designed here in Saskatchewan in about the year 2000. We tested them, and they showed some very similar counts to what a human observer gets in the field when you have a stereo recording. And eventually that led to the field sort of picking up and some companies going, well, hey, we could make something with a lot of the timers that are available and programmability. We can make something that can just be left out in the field and record multiple times. So now we have things like wildlife acoustics units, these two top left ones, or there's some units made from by a company in Australia, and they can either come in mono or stereo recording formats. We like the stereo recording formats because it's easier to get some spatial information, and it's also a lot easier on the brain to listen to a stereo recording than a mono recording. And we've been testing, how. Sorry. We've been testing how to make those data comparable between human observers and ARUs, because if we really want to take advantage of both, they each have advantages and disadvantages in terms of the logistics. We need to make the data speak together. So this is some of the programmability looks like. Typically, a human observer doing surveys would work in this sort of period. The bluish color here depicts the nighttime, and then the yellow is when the light is up. So this is sunrise, and typically a human observer would be working in this range and wandering around in the field and collecting sort of less rigidly than this, but in terms of the time of day. But we can add other recording periods to capture other species. So, for example, nocturnal recordings to catch things like owls, etc. We can also deploy these, say, for example, in the winter and have them come on at times of the year when we don't normally do surveys. So surveys in April and May for things like owls, woodpeckers, and amphibians as soon as the ice comes off. This is an example of some of the advantages that one can get by having those other times of day. So the majority of the species that we've typically surveyed with those human point counts look more like this, with highest probability of detection during the early morning at around sunrise, with it declining throughout the morning and going to almost zero through the afternoon. But things like yellow rail, or actually a lot of species that inhabit wetlands, are more typically more active at night. And so we can capture that sort of data with autonomous recording units a lot more easily than trying to get people out in the boreal wetlands at night. A lot of people typically have thought about ARUs as only collecting species presence absence, and we've been sort of fighting an uphill battle in the literature trying to promote the fact that one can actually get abundance if one is careful in processing the data manually. Of course, there's a lot of emphasis now on using AI to identify species, and thus far that is only amenable to species presence absence. But there are some possible approaches that we're experimenting with. However, if one has paired recordings where a human was doing an observation in the field and a recording unit was in the same place, you see this sort of thing. This is the one-to-one correspondence line, and there's obviously, for a lot of the species, high correlation between the count that you generate by listening to a recording compared to the count that you have a human observer do in the field. There is, obvious scatter in there. So there's in some cases, somebody is, maybe missing something on the recording or miss something in the field. And so there's scatter, but at least it's following that one-to-one correspondence line. There are some far more advanced approaches that one can use with autonomous recording units. If one has recording units that are synchronized down to the millisecond, either by being directly cabled together or having a GPS synchronization on them, you can actually use the difference in the time of arrival of a song arriving at the surrounding ARUs to actually calculate a position of where a bird is, which has a lot of advantages, but it's very intensive on the back end. You have to process a lot of data. If you think of the number of times you hear, say, a robin in your backyard sing, you have to localize that analytically for every song and then repeat that over multiple species. And even just setting up these grids can be very laborious. However, it's a great way of us ground truthing a lot of the other methodologies. So when I first started this new position with the Canadian Wildlife Service, looking at expanding surveys in the north and wanting to make use of both our historic human point count surveys and expand into using ARUs, we had to ask, well, is an autonomous recording unit equivalent to a human observer? I'll show you some of that already, but we also had to come up with the methodology for how to actually combine the data. And I won't go into too much detail here. It's sort of all the math is in this paper. But if you have an expected count from an ARU, an expected count from a human observer, you can actually, break down the components of what that count relates to. So the top here is the density from an ARU and the area and the detection probability over the same for the human. You can start solving that and you end up with a correction factor that you can actually use to place the two data sets on the same footing. And you can actually get really simple with it. You can either run a modeling approach to estimate it, or you can just take the raw ratio of the count from the ARU and the count from the human observer, take the square root of that, and that is an estimate of the difference that you can just plug in as a statistical offset in your other models, and it can be used to place the data on the same footing. So we did, when I first started this position, we actually did some experimenting with this. We surveyed 105 forest stands, split the data post hoc into 70% data for modeling and 30% for validation at 363 individual locations in the boreal forest. And when we estimate those correction factors, well, actually, I'll back up. The open circles here are the sort of the counts or the difference between human observer and ARU in the 30% validation data set without any correction. And then the red filled circles are if you throw in those correction factors and it removes the bias and the difference in those counts. So we have a way of making the data talk to each other. So then I had to work out how can I do studies in the boreal forest where there's almost no road in a somewhat inexpensive fashion. So I won't get into the math of this either, other than to point out a few key things. Like up here, we are all these equations relate to more or less a weighting factor. The probability that you draw a random sample location being inversely proportional to the cost of getting somewhere, the square root of the cost. So all else being equal, if the habitat is the same, you're more likely to sample in an area that's low cost than an area that's high cost. So we created spatially explicit models of the cost of getting to places for different study areas. So I did it for Saskatchewan, a colleague did it in Newfoundland, and another did it in Yukon, where we were piloting this program. We also, sort of weighted the habitats so that rare habitats get sampled more heavily, so that species that have, rare species are often tied to fairly rare habitats. So putting more sampling effort into rare habitats is more likely to capture data on rare species. So now we have a design that we've implemented across Canada, and we've also created sort of this data workflow where we go out and collect the data. We have a bunch of data storage and processing methods and make that data open. So if you're interested in bird data and collaboration, you can come talk to me. We make that data available as soon as we can. Some of it requires some processing before we can get it up and out publicly open, but the data are out there for the public to use. We also work with a lot of data partners, people doing conservation on the ground, and we work with a lot of other projects like the Boreal Avian Modeling Project at the University of Alberta, for example, where either we ourselves or the Boreal Avian Modeling Project are producing products like species distribution models, which can be used to inform conservation. Regionally, we've also, sort of tried to partner with as many projects as we could to make the fieldwork as easy as possible, as well as make the data as meaningful as possible for local partners. So a major one in rolling out in Saskatchewan has been the Saskatchewan Breeding Bird Atlas, which now is sort of being published. So you can go online and find the Breeding Bird Atlas and find species distribution models for Saskatchewan birds. But we've also, worked with Indigenous partners, federal and provincial governments, industry, all helping to collect the data and then often using up the data for their own purposes. And this, good, the GIF is working. So on the left-hand side of the screen there is the rollout that we've managed to do so far in Saskatchewan and Manitoba, where I'm responsible for, but my colleagues across Canada have been helping to fill in gaps across the Northern Boreal. There's a lot of benefits to doing a lot of this collaboratively, and also to that that randomized design, which Erica can attest to, can be a real pain in the butt to get sent to a randomly chosen location in the boreal where you might have to walk through a swamp up to your chest, or other horrible habitats. But we've experienced things like We work with Yapi Nene Land and Resources Group. They're based out of Saskatoon, but they do their work with the communities of the far north of Saskatchewan. They put out a lot of the ARUs themselves, but on one occasion we sent them to one of these randomized locations and had a real nice benefit. They end up discovering this industrial waste from a exploration company, and luckily they actually managed to. They were also reviewing permit applications, and it turns out this company that had this site had a permit application in for another exploration project, and they were able to withhold the permit until they cleaned up this site. So it was a great source of pride for the northern communities that their land office was able to actually, use that to leverage some direct conservation. But it's also very useful in collecting data to inform something called Indigenous-led area-based conservation projects. So there's a push to reach a goal of 30% of Canada being protected by the year 2030. And with a lot of the north being remote and largely inhabited by Indigenous people, Indigenous-led conservation projects is like a major push to achieving that 30% by 2030. And each of these groups is looking for the data that they can find to help justify why an area is valuable. So a lot of it for them is, related to the traditional hunting and harvesting areas, or caribou conservation, but they also want to, protect any endangered species. So they're looking for data on forest bird, for example, or amphibians. So we're able to provide that, especially with the ARUs. They can get out and do a lot of the work themselves. They go to some of the randomized locations that we have already selected, but they also go to areas that are culturally important to them. And we can generate species distribution models for those regions and look at how the projected populations within that area compare to the population within an ecologically similar area. So the same ecoregion or ecozone of a province, or within the province itself, is it disproportionately capturing more of a population than you would expect for that area? Another real neat use in more recent times, this is actually just a preprint, or from a preprint that's out now. I think I have it cited in the next slide, but often one is very interested in microhabitats that are being used, or very refined estimates of habitat. So if one goes into something like this is a clear cut. There's a little patch of residual trees that have been left by the forestry company, and one might want to know how bird populations or species occupancy relates to the area of that particular patch, or the proportion of the surrounding, radius that is made up of those patches. The problem is that, for the most part, those ARUs are giving you an unlimited radius count, right? Whatever the sound attenuation is with distance determines what you end up with on the recording. However, you can go out and do playback experiments to actually try to get at how far a bird is detectable. And so then one can post hoc limit what you actually process from the data post hoc. And so this is the sort of curves they get. This is work done by Isabelle Leboeuf-Taylor out of the University of Alberta, currently in press. And you get these nice detection curves, and they can truncate at what distance they want the survey radius to end at. And when they did that, they found that they compared analyses with unlimited distance radius, a 250-meter radius, and a 150-meter truncated distance. And despite the fact that they lost 61% of the observations at 150 meters, that was always the best sort of model, or the best survey radius for associating the species with their habitat. And you can actually see some implications. I'll just focus in on this one here. So olive-sided flycatcher, this is fitting the relationship of olive-sided flycatcher abundance with both years since harvest, and with versus without retention. And you can see in the unlimited distance survey, the relationship is completely different. So it can have important implications for how you actually manage the landscape if you're using that data. Okay, so we've also, been producing these sorts of products with the Saskatchewan Breeding Bird Atlas. A lot of these species distribution models are used by, we spoke earlier about consulting companies, but when they are given a project that they're bidding on, they often do something called a species pre-screening. They'll look up what species are likely to be there. They'll map out where it falls in this landscape and see if species X, Y, or Z that are endangered or listed in some fashion are likely to be there. They might design specialized surveys to try to detect those species. And so it's directly useful for that. Also, it's a nice snapshot in time. Most of these atlases are done, they're scheduled to be done every 20 years. And for example, right now there's an atlas being done in, the third atlas being done in Ontario, and they produce estimates of species status and the trends through those time periods. We've also been using the data directly to inform landscape management. So I've been working with the Saskatchewan provincial government forestry branch. They manage, everyone is fairly familiar with Saskatchewan. Prince Albert, everybody knows where Prince Albert is. So yes, Prince Albert is in here. This is the Nesbitt Forest. This is Port Alicorn Forest. The whole patch there is called the Island Forests. The Saskatchewan government does all the management planning for it and gives out individual licenses to people to do forest harvesting. But they have a public advisory group that was interested in metrics of performance. One of them being the Canada warbler, which is a listed species in Canada. And so we developed, using the data that we've collected, models linking Canada warbler abundance to commonly managed variables in the forest industry. So stand age and stand type. So whether it's a hardwood, mixed wood, or conifer forest, and we were able to predict densities of Canada warblers in those specific types. And they then use simulation models projecting how much forest of those particular types and ages they'll have over the next 20 years. And it then sets some benchmarks and expectations for what will happen to Canada warbler abundance. They've actually been implementing a lot of the survey effort now for me as well. So it's sort of mutually beneficial work. We've also been using actually those specific models where we reviewed some proposals to get funding for tree planting under Canada's 2 billion trees program. I don't know if you've heard of that, but it's a program to try to address climate change by planting 2 billion trees over the next couple of years. And we were actually able to say, well, your land base there has Canada warbler, it's a species of concern. All of your planting that you're planning is only conifer. And they also had some concerns around forest fire. So we were like, can you plant hardwoods in areas that have moist soils and try to use those to provide future habitat for Canada warbler, as well as potentially provide a fire break around your community. So I'm not sure what the latest on that has been, but we were able to provide some direct management recommendations. This is some work that Eric is smiling because this is something she's been working on recently. The province also has what they call their habitat management plan. They developed for every major ecosystem in Saskatchewan within the forest management zone, southern boreal portion. They were interested in using our boreal bird data to develop some indicators where they'll, sort of do red light, green light, whether they're meeting performance objectives. And so we've used some multivariate analyses to sort of try to make sure we are covering the major habitat gradients for species. So the red species in here are the species that we defined as potential species to track. And they're representing different sort of forest type and age classes across all the various gradients of upland forest. And the nice thing about this is that we'll actually be collecting data through time, and that data will also include multi-species surveys. We quantify all the other species, not just the ones that we've set as local species for this. So we'll have a long-term test of whether or not those species are actually representing what we're hoping that they do. We've also, been collaborating very heavily with the Boreal Avian Modeling Project, where our data are directly feeding into national species distribution models. So this, for example, is the black-polled warbler species, which has undergone something on the order of a 90% decline over the past 30 years. So there's a lot of concern for it. And now we are able to, produce nationally consistent models of the abundance and distribution of species like these, and use those in various conservation efforts. So one major conservation partnership that we have with Environment Canada and other organizations is through what are called the Habitat Joint Ventures. Habitat Joint Ventures are sort of built around waterbird or duck conservation, but they've taken a new direction of trying to conserve as many species as they can. And so they're trying to heap on species distribution models, not only of just the ducks, but now also like land birds, shorebirds, and whatever else they can to try to find priority areas to either, work with forestry companies and implement some new experimental or best management practices, or try to inform those sort of indigenous-led area-based conservation wherever there's an opportunity. They're working, and it's a very collaborative mechanism too, because the Habitat Joint Ventures have representation from the federal government, provincial governments, Ducks Unlimited, all kinds of organizations. So basically, there's a great combination of people that legally control the land base, along with people with a lot of the scientific knowledge and indigenous partners. So it's a great mechanism actually getting work done on the land. We've also been trying to, make the most of our data at a global scale. So one of the projects that I've been involved in recently is the Worldwide Soundscapes Project. We've worked collaboratively to try to quantify where people have been collecting these soundscape recordings globally, and quantify not just the spatial, temporal, and even like vertical and subterranean distribution of sampling, but also, identify where are the gaps, because hopefully that will prompt somebody to go and do some of these sorts of surveys, or maybe say, for example, if it's in an area that is not traditionally having a lot of Western science done, maybe they could find partnerships to provide funding or equipment to loan to those regions. So it's another opportunity to make data discoverable and useful for larger analyses. So in this paper, we sort of summarized some of the ways that the data might be useful. So this is some examples of quantifying how much of a recording is made up of what's called anthropophony, so human-made noises or noise pollution, biophony, so all the biological noises of birds, insects, mammals, etc., and geophony. You might have, say, for example, seismic activity that generates a sound, or wind, those sorts of things. And so, there might be some biogeography applications. Say, for example, how much biophonic signal do you have relative to latitude? In conservation biology, a big one is what is the impact of noise pollution on biophony or individual species. So we're trying to make the data discoverable so that people can make use of this globally. And I think this actually is an area I'd like to see some I'd like to collaborate with people locally on, because I think there's actually a lot of potential as a conservation tool. I think we can go ahead and go over this huge repository of recordings that are being created locally and across Canada and maybe even across the globe, and try to see if we can actually predict where not only noise pollution is occurring, but where it's not occurring. So, for example, this is one of my recordings here. All these little spikes are actually cars going by. You get that sort of Doppler effect. You get these little spikes, and it's something that one could probably build AI and predict. But there's all these other things occurring on the landscape. So locally, in some of the remote boreal forests or semi-remote, a lot of the forestry activity, oil and gas, the compressor stations are actually, there's been a fair amount of work on the impact of the noise pollution from compressor stations on boreal forest bird communities in the oil sands region. There's also things like snowmobiles, where there's some technical challenges there because the ARUs don't work so well at -40, but if we could map out quiet spaces, it could have some conservation benefits. So this is some of the examples of work that has been done. It's sort of a burgeoning area of research. There's decent evidence that bird communities have to adjust themselves to the noise pollution around them. Often you see a decrease in density around areas. There's actually some fascinating behavioral work as well, where there's been work on species like chickadees show they actually have to adjust their song type when they're in a noisy environment. So there's maybe some evolutionary impacts too on the species. And I think this is the sort of thing that we can get into. We can start mapping out the soundscapes, the noiseescapes, and eventually, I think if we did that, we could actually start promoting an idea very much like dark sky preserves. I'm sure everybody's heard of dark sky preserves, areas with low light pollution where it's still good to go and look at the stars and have observatories and those sorts of things. But we could also have quiet sky preserves, and that might be something that we might want to promote in conservation. The other thing that we can take advantage of there is there are known impacts of noise pollution on human health and mental health as well. So, one of the major benefits to national parks has often been, and also the Japanese concept of forest bathing, is that there's a very large reduction in human stress if one goes out into the natural environment. And if we could promote areas even within existing parks or new parks based on those quiet spaces and trying to preserve those, I think it would be a new way of promoting new conservation initiatives. There's also some really cool stuff now happening where one can use AI to get into the weeds with a lot of the bird or not just birds. One could do this with a number of species, but one can run AI over a suite of recordings. In this case, this is done with one of those localization arrays, so that they actually have, mapped out individual birds multiple